Welcome students to lesson 8 of the Living World topic. In this lesson we are going to be further exploring the idea of a biome. And in particular we will be focusing on why biomes are located where they are in the world. This will build upon the previous two lessons where we understood the factors that affect different climates around the world. This is a very important idea. Please take a moment to write the date, title and learning objective and have a pen and paper ready to learn. Okay, time to review prior learning. Please write 1 to 10, answer the questions from memory and then mark your answers. Game time. Number 1. The species in an ecosystem are interdependent, which means that a change in the population of one affects the population of others. 2. The nutrient cycle describes how energy moves through an ecosystem. 3. The informal economy describes people in jobs that are not protected by contracts, pay no taxes, nor have bank accounts. 4. Volcanic eruptions can cause temporary global cooling because they release a gas that reflects sunlight called sulfur dioxide. 5. Building cedar fences and planting drought-resistant crops are examples of climate change adaptations. 6. The wolf was reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in the USA, leading to a significant rise in biodiversity and amount of vegetation. 7. A keystone species has a very important role in an ecosystem, and removing it leads to biodiversity loss. 8. The Buffelsdrij afforestation project in South Africa led to increased biodiversity. For example, more birds and insects were there. 9. A nature reserve is a protected natural area that cannot be damaged by human activities such as logging. 10. Eutrophication is the excess of nutrients in a body of water, for example, a lake or a river, which causes algal blooms that kill plants, leading to a loss of oxygen. Give yourselves a mark out of 10. If you got 8 or more, excellent, you've really understood the previous lessons. Write any questions you got wrong and their answers and then test yourselves on them repeatedly. Okay, to introduce this lesson, I'm going to ask you to revise and recap prior knowledge from other topics and some basic ideas. So I'm going to show you a couple of images and questions next to each. Answer each set of questions and then we will discuss the answers. Go for it. So here's the Earth. And these red lines show sunlight hitting the Earth at different points, at the equator and near the North Pole. Try and answer these questions. Okay, let's discuss the answers. Which part of the Earth gets the most direct sunlight, A or B? You should have said B gets the most direct sunlight. The sunlight is hitting directly, as opposed to at A where it's at an angle. 2. Which part of the Earth does the sunlight have to travel through the least air, A or B? The sunlight has to travel through the least air at B. You can see because there's the shortest distance through the atmosphere, whereas at A it has to travel through a much greater amount of atmosphere of air. 3. Which part of the Earth will be the hottest, A or B? B is much hotter than A, partly because the sunlight has to travel through less air, which means less of the sunlight is reflected or absorbed by the air, and also because the sunlight is more direct, so it's the same amount of energy is spread over a smaller area, so it heats it up more. Question 2. Look at these diagrams. This shows 3 different objects and how they react when you put them in water. A sponge, wood, and metal. Answer these questions. So number 1, box A is denser than box B. What does density mean? So density is the amount of atoms that a material has in a certain amount of area, in a certain volume. So A is denser than B because it has more atoms within the same volume. 2, what happens to the density of air when it warms up? When you warm up air, the atoms vibrate more in the air and they spread apart. So there are fewer atoms in the same amount of space. As a result, the density goes from more like A to more like B. So the density decreases. 3. What happens to warm air at the equator? Where does it go and why? Well, when something becomes less dense, it rises above things that are more dense. For example, the sponge, if you push it underwater and let it go, it will rise above the water and float because the sponge is less dense than the water. The sponge is like B, whereas the water is like A. Similarly, the wood will rise above the water. By contrast, the metal will sink beneath the water because it's denser than the water. The metal is more like A and the water is more like B. So warm air rises at the equator to a higher point in the atmosphere because it is less dense than the surrounding air, which is cooler. 4. What happens to the air pressure at the equator, and what weather does this create? The air pressure at the ground at the equator falls, so you get low air pressure. Air pressure is the amount of air in a space. So when there's less air in a space because it's risen up at the equator, you have low pressure at the surface. What weather does this create? Well, it creates heavy rain because the rising warm air contains water vapor, which has evaporated. That water vapor cools down and condenses at higher altitudes, and so it forms clouds and therefore rain. There is also intense wind at the equator very often because the low air pressure at the equator pulls in air from surrounding higher pressure areas. In this lesson, we'll be exploring this idea further so that you understand why the world's biomes are where they are. Join me. So the big question, why do the biomes follow the latitudes? This map, as you will recall from the previous lesson on biomes, shows the world's biomes and where they are. You have the hot biomes like the deserts and the rainforests near the equator, and you have the very cold biomes like the tundra and the polar biome near the poles. As you can see by this map, the biomes are spread out horizontally around the world. They tend to be at similar latitudes around the world. For example, the boreal forest, also known as the taiga or the coniferous forest, is spread thinly around the same latitudes. Similarly, the rainforest is spread around the same latitudes, and the hot deserts around the same latitudes. So why is that? Let's find out. We're going to focus on the tropical latitudes here for this understanding. So between the Tropic of Cancer, 23.5 degrees north of the equator, and the Tropic of Capricorn, 23.5 degrees south of the equator, and the equator here. And the tropics are everything within these two lines. But for this, we're going to focus on 30 degrees north here and 30 degrees south and everything within it. Let me show you what's happening between these latitudes so you understand why the biomes follow the latitudes. These 3 arrows show sunlight and the angle at which it hits the Earth at these different latitudes. At the equator, sunlight hits the Earth directly, meaning it's focused over the smallest area. Consequently, the ground and the air gets the hottest here. And so the air spreads out and becomes less dense. As a result, it rises. When the air rises, because of direct sunlight making the ground very hot, there is less air remaining at the surface. This means there's low pressure at the surface, less air at the surface. When the warm air and water vapor rises, it cools down because at higher altitudes the atmosphere is colder. That water vapor condenses into clouds and then it rains intensely. That's why you get tropical rainforests at the equator. However, that cool air then spreads out to 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. Because it's cool and it's dry because all the moisture has fallen out of the air as rain, it becomes more dense than the surrounding air. And as you know, more dense objects sink when surrounded by less dense objects. So at 30 degrees north and south of the equator, the cold air sinks. Consequently, at these latitudes you have constant bands of high air pressure going around the world, sinking air. Lots of air near the surface, high air pressure. Less air near the surface, low air pressure. When cold, dry air sinks, it warms up, and so it cannot condense to form clouds, and so you cannot have rain. And that's why you have hot deserts at these latitudes. The sunlight is still quite strong here, even though it is at an angle compared to at the equator. And because there are no clouds, there's no rain. So the hottest areas of the world are in fact around 30 degrees north and south. When the cold air reaches the ground at the 30 degrees north and south latitudes, it warms up again. And because there's high air pressure at 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator, and low air pressure at the equator, the air moves towards the equator as warm surface winds. This happens because air always moves from areas of high air pressure to areas of low air pressure. Think of what happens if you squeeze a balloon filled with air and then poke it with a needle. All the air rushes out really fast because it goes from high air pressure inside the balloon to lower air pressure outside the balloon. That's why the balloon pops, because the air is coming out so fast. So how can we show this on a map of the world, this pattern of the biomes? This map here shows the direction that air travels from the Earth's surface. At the equator, you have a low air pressure, and so air is rising, intense direct heat. The rising air spreads out to 30 degrees north and south and sinks at 30 degrees north and south. When the air sinks and reaches the ground at 30 degrees north and south, it spreads out again towards the equator and towards 60 degrees north and 60 degrees south of the equator. At these latitudes, the air rises again, so you have low air pressure at 60 north and 60 south, as well as at the equator. That's why in Britain here you have regular rainfall, because there's regular low air pressure here. By contrast, at 30 degrees north and south, cooling air and dry air sink, and so you have high air pressure. That air spreads out when it reaches the ground, rises at 60 north and south, but then spreads out again to the poles and sinks again, and so you have high air pressure near the north and south pole, which is why there is very little rainfall or even snow at the poles. They are also called deserts for this reason. So at 30 degrees and 90 degrees north and south of the equator, you have deserts, because you have regular high pressure, sinking air. Okay. This is a simple way of showing how the air moves around the world. And it all happens because the Earth is heated most strongly at the equator and less strongly the further north and south of the equator you go. Which means that the air becomes the least dense at the equator and more dense the further north and south you go because of the difference in temperature. This means that air is constantly on the move on Earth, from the equator towards the North Pole and towards the South Pole. And we call this moving air from the equator to the North and South Pole atmospheric circulation. Similar to how blood circulates around your body, air circulates around the world. And we can show this through a model called the Global Atmospheric Circulation Model here. As you can see at the equator, there is low air pressure, air is rising, it's warm, it's rising. It cools down when it reaches higher altitudes, it spreads out to 30 degrees north and south, it sinks as cold air, high air pressure at 30 north and south. When it's come down to the ground, it warms up, and so it spreads out to 60 north and 60 south as surface winds. It also spreads back towards the equator, here and here. As it's warmed up, it becomes less dense again, and so it rises. And this is constantly happening, air rising at the equator and moving out towards the poles, and then returning towards the equator. At the equator, hot area, lower air pressure, air rises. Similarly, at 60 degrees north and south of the equator, warm surface airs become less dense, rise, so you get low air pressure there as well. At 30 degrees north and south of the equator, you have sinking cold air, so you have high air pressure, lots of air near the ground. Consequently, air circulates globally around the world from the equator towards the poles. Let's zoom in on this area of the Earth's global atmospheric circulation between 30 degrees north and south. These circular movements of air around the world are called cells. And the cells that move from the equator to 30 degrees north and south are called the Hadley cell. As you can see, there is low air pressure at the equator because the air has risen, so there's less near the ground. But there is higher air pressure at 30 degrees north and south because the air has sunk. So you get clouds and rain at the equator, and you get no clouds, no rain, hot deserts at 30 degrees north and south. So how does this explain why the biomes follow the latitudes then? Well, this map here shows tropical rainforest. And as you can see from the blue, where the tropical rainforests are located, they are almost always located around the equator, because that is where you have low air pressure and rising air. As the air rises, which has a lot of water vapor in it, it cools, forms clouds, and so you get constant rainfall every single day, leading to tropical rainforests, because plants grow very well here. By contrast, the world's hot deserts, shown by this red, form around 30 degrees north and south of the equator, where you have high air pressure, sinking cold air, which is spread out from the equator. Because it's high pressure here regularly at these latitudes, you almost never get rain, so it's very dry. And because of the intense heat at this latitude, because it's still fairly close to the equator, it's very hot. So you get hot deserts at these latitudes. The distance from the equator is the main factor affecting the biomes on Earth and the rainfall. We get forests in the UK because we have regular rainfall. That's because we have a low pressure band, 60 degrees north. So, as you can see, global atmospheric circulation, the way the air moves around the world, explains whether you get rainfall or not, and explains whether it's hot or cold, and therefore explains whether you get different biomes. Excellent. Time to assess learning. Please write 1 to 10. Answer the questions using your understanding, and then mark your answers. Go for it. Number 1. Which part of the Earth gets the most direct and focused sunlight? Should have said the equator. 2. Density means the number of atoms of a substance within an area. 3. A denser object sinks when placed in a less dense liquid. 4. When air is warmed up, the molecules spread out. 5. When air is warmed up, it becomes less dense. 6. When air is warmed up, it rises above the surrounding colder air. 7. At the equator, air rises, leaving less air near the surface of the Earth, so you get low air pressure. 8. When air, which is filled with water vapor, rises in the atmosphere, it cools and condenses to form clouds and rain. 9. When there is high air pressure, this means that cold air at high altitude sinks because it is denser than the surrounding warmer air. 10. Hot deserts are found around 30 degrees latitude north and south of the equator because there is high air pressure, which means the air is sinking, warming up, and so cannot condense to form clouds, so there is no rain. Give yourselves a mark out of 10. If you got 9 or more, excellent. If not, go back, watch the explanations again, then attempt this again. Right, time to embed learning. I'm going to show you some questions. Answer them using your understanding and then mark your answers. Game time. So number 1. Explain why average temperatures on Earth decrease further north and south of the equator. You should have said, less direct sunlight, more atmosphere it must pass through. 1. Sunlight more spread out, more absorbed at greater angle before reaching the ground. 1. 2. Explain why there are high levels of precipitation at the equator and 60 degrees north and south of it. You should have said that air is rising at these latitudes. You should have explained what happens when it rises. It cools and condenses. And you should have also said that there are bands of low pressure and how they remain constant around these latitudes. 3. Explain why hot deserts are found 30 degrees north and south of the equator. Sunlight direct, intense heat. Atmospheric circulation. Talk about how the cool air spreads out and why it sinks. Explain that the dry sinking air warms up and so it cannot condense into clouds, so there's no rainfall, so you get hot deserts. 4. Explain why the tops of mountains are cold even when they are near the equator. At higher altitude, air temperature decreases. This is because there's less air at higher altitude, low air pressure. So heat cannot spread easily because heat needs atoms to spread. Therefore, even with direct sunlight at the equator, mountain tops are cold. Please give yourselves a mark out of the total. Make sure, and this is really important, that you correct any mistakes or missing points in green. Excellent. From this lesson, write 2 questions from anything you've learned. Answer them from memory and then test yourselves in a week. Thank you so much for joining me this lesson. Next lesson, we are going to be exploring our first biome of 2 that we're going to study in this topic, which is the tropical rainforest. Join me then. Thank you.